All right, so you want to dive into some pretty heavy stuff, huh? You asked about Trump, his cabinet picks, maybe even associates acting as Russian agents. What would that mean for the U.S. government, for the military? Kind of a Trojan horse situation, right?
Yeah, a Trojan horse. That's one way to put it.
And to really dig into this, our main source is Tom Hartman's Substack article, Are Trump's Appointees the Trojan Horses that could lead to America's strategic collapse?
Ooh, wow, that title alone. It
Yeah.
really makes you think.
It does, right. And just to be clear, we're not just looking at Hartman's take. We've got news articles, government documents, even investigative reports, a whole stack to go through.
Yeah, we're going to try to get as complete a picture as we can for you.
Exactly. And remember, we're just laying out what these sources say. We're not adding our own 2 cents or taking sides here.
Right. Think of us as your deep dive buddies helping you navigate these sometimes choppy waters.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole Trojan horse idea. Hartman starts with Trump's Schedule F executive order. You remember that one?
Yeah.
From back in 2020.
I do. Now, it may sound kind of boring, bureaucratic, but this is where it gets interesting. This order was all about reclassifying tons of federal employees and taking away a lot of their protections, making them easier to fire.
And who would he replace them with?
Loyalists. People who'd answer to Trump, not necessarily to the country or the Constitution. Hartman suggesting this wasn't just about shaking things up, it was about consolidating power. Imagine a government where experience and expertise take a backseat to blind loyalty.
Well, man, that kind of sounds like it could undermine, the checks and balances that are supposed to prevent any one person from having too much power.
Exactly. Critics were calling it a direct attack on the professional civil service, something that could really cripple the effectiveness, the integrity of the whole system.
It's like swapping out experienced pilots for yes men right as the plane is about to take off. And the scariest part, even though Biden reversed this order, the blueprint's still there, right? Some future president could just dust it off and try again.
That's the chilling thought Hartman leaves us with.
Like a virus lying dormant, waiting for the right conditions.
Exactly.
Okay, so Schedule F, a potential tool for stacking the deck. But Hartman doesn't stop there. He goes deep into Trump's relationship with Putin. And that's where things get even more interesting.
He goes beyond just skimming the surface and lays out a very detailed timeline of all of Trump's actions, statements regarding Putin and Russia. And what emerges is a pattern, a consistent thread of favoritism towards Russia, often at the expense of U.S. interests, even our allies.
So we're not just talking about a few off-the-cuff comments. This seems deliberate, strategic even.
That's the implication. Remember all those times Trump praised Putin's intelligence, his leadership. He even questioned the value of NATO.
I remember those moments. They were pretty jarring, especially coming from a U.S. president. It felt like watching a quarterback openly cheering for the other team.
Exactly. And it went beyond words. Hartman points to concrete actions like Trump's constant efforts to undermine sanctions against Russia, after they annex Crimea and interfere in our elections.
Right, it's like rewarding bad behavior, but on a global scale. And let's not forget how he downplayed Russian interference in our elections, almost like he was trying to sweep it under the rug.
One way to look at it. And all of this, Hartman argues, adds up to something he calls Putin's payout.
Putin's payout. It's catchy, but also kind of terrifying when you think about it, especially when you consider that this was such a departure from the traditional Republican stance on Russia. They've always been the tough guys on Russia, haven't they?
Historically, yeah, the Republican Party has been pretty hawkish on Russia, which makes Trump's stance even more peculiar. It raises questions, why the sudden shift?
Okay, so we've got Schedule F and Putin's payout. Two pretty big pieces of the puzzle. What else does Hartman bring to light?
He shines a spotlight on Trump's inner circle, revealing a network of allies and associates pushing these pro-Russia policies, even actively working to weaken U.S. institutions.
So it's not just Trump acting alone.
That's what makes it so concerning. Hartman's arguing that it's a coordinated effort. Like, take Mike Flynn, for example. Remember him? He was Trump's national security advisor for a hot minute before having to resign for lying about his conversations with the Russian ambassador.
Yeah, and then it came out that he was also working as a foreign agent for Turkey. What a mess.
Right. And Hartman suggests that Flynn's presence, even if brief, it was indicative of a larger trend in Trump's orbit. He highlights Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, convicted of financial crimes, admitted to sharing campaign data with a Russian associate during the 2016 election.
Wow, okay. So people in Trump's inner circle with direct ties to Russia, what were they trying to achieve?
Million-dollar question, right? Hartman suggests they were part of this effort to push those pro-Russia policies and undermine U.S. institutions, opening the door for more Russian influence within our government.
This is starting to sound like a spy movie. Double agents, hidden agendas, the whole 9 yards.
I know, right? And it goes even deeper. Hartman brings up groups like the Center for Renewing America, America First Legal, conservative organizations very active during Trump's presidency. They were pushing for some radical changes to the U.S. government, and they really tried to discredit those investigations into Russian interference.
So not just agreeing with Trump, they're actively working to reshape the system.
Exactly. And Hartman's point is they're still very much in the game, waiting in the wings. If Trump were to be reelected, they'd be ready to step into those positions of power and implement their agenda.
This is getting pretty intense. It sounds like Hartman's saying there's a whole network of individuals, organizations working to advance goals that line up with Russia's interest. Trump's at the center of it all.
That's the picture he's painting. He even uses the phrase shadow government, which sounds pretty ominous. It captures the idea that there's this group of people ready to take over and push through this radical agenda that could change how the U.S. government operates, maybe forever.
Okay, so we have this shattered government of Trump loyalists, some with ties to Russia, pushing an ideology that seems to benefit Russia. And Trump himself, well, he seems to have a soft spot for Putin. So where do we go from here? What's the next layer of this onion?
Hartman takes us into even more unsettling territory. Trump's actions regarding classified information and intelligence agencies, this is where the national security risks become really clear.
Okay, let's unpack that. What kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, Hartman points to specific instances where Trump's actions, well, they raise serious red flags about his judgment and his relationship with the intelligence community. Like, do you remember that time he disclosed classified information to Russian officials right there in the Oval Office?
Vaguely remind me.
Okay, so back in 2017, Trump's meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the Russian Ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, in the Oval Office. And during that meeting, he reveals highly classified intelligence about an ISIS plot, information that Israel had shared with us with the understanding that, we wouldn't share it further.
And why was that a problem?
Intelligence officials were freaking out. Revealing that kind of information to Russia, even if it's about a common enemy like ISIS, it could put intelligence sources at risk, compromise delicate operations.
I see. It's like breaking a promise, but on a global scale.
Exactly. It erodes that trust that's so crucial for intelligence sharing between allies, and it could make it way harder to gather that vital information in the future.
Okay, so it wasn't just about the information itself. It was about who he shared it with and the potential fallout from that.
Exactly. Sharing intelligence, it requires careful consideration, a deep understanding of the possible ramifications.
Got it. So what other actions regarding intelligence agencies does Hartman highlight?
Well, he points to Trump's constant attempts to discredit, undermine U.S. intelligence agencies, like the FBI, the CIA. Remember all those times he'd publicly bash them, question their findings, call them names, especially when it came to Russian interference in the election.
Yeah, that felt like a recurring theme throughout his presidency. It seemed like he was waging war on his own intelligence community.
That's how a lot of people saw it. And Hartman argues that this wasn't just about his ego or, him not liking to be contradicted. It was a deliberate attempt to chip away at public trust in these institutions.
So by discrediting these agencies, he could control the narrative, avoid accountability. Is that what Hartman's suggesting?
One interpretation. And it all ties back to that shadow government idea. If you can discredit the sources of information that challenge your narrative, well, it becomes easier to install your own people, reshape the system.
Okay, this is getting deep.
Yeah.
And we're just getting started.
We are.
So we've got this potential shadow government filled with Trump loyalists, some with ties to Russia, pushing an ideology that, well, it seems to align with Russia's interests. We've got Trump himself, seemingly enamored with Putin, and we've got this pattern of him undermining our own intelligence agencies, sharing sensitive information with Russia. How does all of this connect back to the listener's question about Trump and his appointees potentially acting as Trojan horses for Russian interests?
That's the question, isn't it? And Hartman, he doesn't explicitly accuse anyone of being a Russian agent, but he does raise concerns about the potential for individuals within Trump's circle to act in ways that benefit Russia, whether they know it or not.
So he's not saying they're all Russian spies, but their actions could have the same effect.
Exactly. And he points to Trump's attempts to install loyalists in key intelligence positions, even when those individuals lacked the experience or the qualifications. Remember the whole saga with Michael Flynn and all the controversy around his appointment as National Security Advisor?
And what about Kash Patel, the guy Trump reportedly wanted to put in charge of the CIA, or was it the FBI? Didn't that cause a huge uproar within the intelligence community?
Huge. Even former Attorney General Bill Barr, he wrote in his memoir that he told the then Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that Patel becoming Deputy FBI Director would happen, and I quote, over my dead body.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. So what's the takeaway here? What's so important about this?
Hartman argues that these attempts to put loyalists in charge of intelligence, combined with Trump's constant attacks on the credibility of those agencies, could have seriously damaged the integrity and the independence of these vital institutions.
And that could make them more vulnerable to manipulation from outside forces, like Russia.
Precisely. When you have people in those positions of power, people who are more loyal to a person or an ideology than to the institution itself, well, it creates vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited.
This is heavy stuff. We've covered so much, but there's still so much to explore.
I know. This is a deep dive in the truest sense. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about something that keeps coming up in a lot of these sources, the potential consequences of all of this, especially if Trump were to be reelected.
Yeah, good point. We're not just dealing with hypothetical situations here. We're talking about real-world implications that could affect all of us.
Exactly. And we have to be careful here because we're dealing with some extreme possibilities, but we also can't just ignore what these sources are telling us.
Right. We need to be both responsible and thorough. So let's look at what these sources suggest could happen if some of these trends continue. All right, buckle up, everyone. This is where things could get really interesting.
One of the most concerning claims comes from an article in Axios, Inside Trump 25, a radical plan for Trump's second term. It lays out a strategy, spearheaded by Trump allies, to completely reshape the federal government if he were to be reelected.
So we're back to Schedule F and purging civil servants.
Exactly. But the Axios piece, it goes even further, suggesting that Trump's allies are working on plans that would go way beyond just firing people. They're talking about stripping layers at the Justice Department, including the FBI, reaching into national security, intelligence, the State Department, even the Pentagon.
Wow, so we're not just talking about firing a few bureaucrats. This is about restructuring the entire government.
That's what this article suggests. And it's not just about firing people. It's about replacing them with people loyal to Trump and his America First ideology.
So back to that shadow government idea.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, it's not just a hypothetical. It's a plan.
Right. And the Axios article names names. It points to figures like Jeffrey Clark, the controversial lawyer Trump wanted to install as Attorney General in the final days of his presidency, and Kash Patel, who, as we mentioned, Trump reportedly wanted to put in charge of either the CIA or the FBI.
Those are some pretty extreme figures.
Yeah.
Clark was a major player in Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election, and Patel's been a vocal critic of the intelligence community.
Exactly. And those are just two examples. The Axios article identifies a whole network of individuals and groups who are actively working to prepare for a potential second Trump administration with the goal of putting this radical agenda into action.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, that this plan is successful. Trump gets reelected, purges the government, installs his loyalists. What happens next?
That's where things get really speculative, but some of these sources offer some disturbing possibilities.
Like what? Give us the worst-case scenario.
Well, some experts are suggesting that this kind of radical restructuring of the government, it could pave the way for a more authoritarian style of rule. They argue that by weakening these institutions, consolidating power in the hands of loyalists, Trump could erode the checks and balances that are so essential to a functioning democracy.
So we're talking about a potential slide towards authoritarianism.
That's the fear. And it's not just coming from, liberal critics. Even some Republicans have expressed concern about the direction Trump is taking the country.
This is getting really intense. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're talking about hypotheticals here.
Right. But it's important to think about the possible consequences. And it's not just about domestic politics. It's about global power dynamics, too.
What do you mean?
Well, if the U.S. were to weaken its democratic institutions and become more isolationist under a second Trump administration, that could create a power vacuum that Russia and other authoritarian regimes could exploit.
So this isn't just about the U.S., it's about the global balance of power.
Exactly. And that's where things get really scary.
Okay, I think we need to take a break here. This is a lot to digest.
Good idea. We've covered a lot, but there's still more to explore. It's interesting, this whole conversation, it connects to this bigger trend we're seeing globally, the rise of these strongman leaders, the erosion of democratic norms. It's like a playbook, being shared across borders.
Yeah, no, it's definitely giving me some food for thought. But before we go too far down that road, let's get back to those payouts Hartman mentions. We've talked about the idea, but what are some actual examples, where Trump's actions seem to have really benefited Russia?
Okay, let's get specific. Hartman and several other sources, they highlight Trump's hesitation to give military aid to Ukraine, a prime example of a payout. Remember, Russia invaded and took Crimea back in 2014, and they've been supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine ever since.
Right, and Ukraine's been begging the U.S. and its allies for help in their fight against Russia.
Exactly. But Trump was always hesitant to provide lethal aid, even though there was bipartisan support for it in Congress. He delayed those shipments of Javelin anti-tank missiles, which were critical for Ukraine's defense. And he even tried to pressure Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden and his son, Hunter, in exchange for releasing that military aid.
Ah, yes, the infamous quid pro quo led to Trump's first impeachment.
Precisely. And Hartman argues that this reluctance to help Ukraine, along with Trump's, his open admiration for Putin, it sent a very clear message to Moscow. Like, the U.S. isn't going to get in their way when it comes to Ukraine, almost like giving them permission to just keep going with their aggression.
And that's a big deal, right? Because Ukraine is seen as this buffer state between Russia and NATO.
Huge. If Russia were to take full control of Ukraine, it would completely shift the power dynamics in Europe, put a lot of pressure on those NATO allies.
So by weakening Ukraine, Trump was indirectly making Russia stronger, like a zero-sum game, but on the world stage.
That's exactly the argument that Hartman and others are making. It's not about some, secret backroom deal. It's about a bunch of actions that, when you put them all together, have major consequences.
Okay, so that's one pretty strong example. What else do we have?
Well, let's not forget about Syria. Remember when Trump suddenly announced he was pulling U.S. troops out of Syria back in 2018?
Yeah, that came out of nowhere. Blindsided a lot of people, including our allies. I think even some of Trump's own advisors were caught off guard.
Exactly. And guess who benefited the most from that decision?
Russia. Right. They were able to step right in, fill the void left by the U.S., and strengthen their position in the region. It was like handing them a strategic victory.
You got it. And Hartman argues that this was another perfect example of Trump's actions playing right into Putin's hands. By ditching our allies in Syria, he basically gave control of that region to Russia.
Okay, so that's two pretty big examples, Ukraine and Syria. Are there any others that really stand out?
Oh, yeah. Hartman points to Trump's constant efforts to undermine NATO, another payout for Putin, if you will.
Right, always bashing NATO, questioning the U.S. commitment to our allies, like watching someone trying to dismantle a house from the inside.
That's a good way to put it. And Hartman says all that rhetoric, combined with his actions, delaying military aid to Ukraine, pulling troops out of Syria, it all had a corrosive effect on the alliance, weakening its unity and resolve.
And a weak NATO, well, that's something Putin would definitely be happy about.
No doubt. NATO has been this major obstacle to Russia's ambitions for decades.
Okay, so we've got Ukraine, Syria, and NATO. Anything else on this list of payouts?
Hartman also brings up Trump's constant praise for Putin and his attempts to downplay Russian interference in the 2016 election. Like, he was trying to make Putin seem legitimate, minimize the threat Russia posed.
It's true, it was a constant theme during Trump's presidency. He just couldn't criticize Putin or really acknowledge how serious Russia's actions were. Like, he was afraid to say anything bad about him.
And that, Hartman argues, is part of the problem. By never really condemning Putin's actions, Trump created this atmosphere of, impunity. Like, he was signaling to Russia that they could get away with messing with U.S. elections, interfering in other countries, without any real consequences.
It's kind of a scary thought. So we've got a pretty solid list of examples. But what do these other sources say about this Putin's payout idea? Are there any other perspectives?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's this article from the Center for American Progress Action Fund, Putin's Payout, 12 ways Trump has supported Putin's foreign policy agenda. They really dig into this concept, go beyond what Hartman covers, provide this really comprehensive list of all these actions Trump took that benefited Russia. It paints a pretty, stark picture.
Okay, that sounds like a must-read.
Yeah.
What are some of the key points they make?
Well, they highlight Trump's efforts to weaken and divide that transatlantic alliance, his attacks on the European Union, his support for Brexit, his attempts to disrupt American leadership in the global economy, and his willingness to make Putin's regime seem legitimate on the world stage. It's like a systematic dismantling of U.S. influence.
Wow, that's a lot. Can you give me some specific examples?
Sure, they point to things like Trump questioning the value of NATO, imposing those tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Europe, which really strained relations with our allies. His withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, which destabilized the region and gave Russia more opportunities to exert influence. His over-the-top praise for Putin's leadership, and his reluctance to call out Russia's human rights abuses. Each action on its own, it might seem small, but when you put them all together, it creates this pattern of behavior that raises some serious red flags.
So they're basically arguing that Trump's actions have weakened the U.S. and our allies, and at the same time, they've strengthened Russia's position in the world.
That's the core argument, and they present a pretty convincing case.
This is some seriously heavy stuff. But it's really important to understand the risks, the full scope of what we're dealing with here.
I agree. And it's not just about Russia. It's about this global trend of democratic decline, the rise of authoritarianism, and Trump's actions, both here at home and on the world stage, they seem to be feeding into that trend.
Right, like we're witnessing a global power shift and democracy is losing ground.
That's a pretty sobering way to put it, but it's hard to argue with the facts.
Okay, I think we need to pause here for a second. Let all of this sink in.
Good idea. We've gone pretty deep here, but there's still more to explore.
Right. When we come back, we'll shift gears a bit. We'll look at the role of conservative media, how they shape public opinion, and how they create an environment where these pro-Russia and pro-authoritarian ideas can spread.
All right, so we've explored some pretty unsettling stuff. Potential payouts to Russia, that whole shadow government idea, Trump's actions with intelligence agencies. It's a lot.
It is. It really is. And this all plays out against this backdrop of this rapidly changing media landscape, which just adds another layer to all of this.
Exactly. And that's where I want to focus now. Hartman's article kind of touches on this, and it's been bugging me this whole time. What role did conservative media play in all of this? Shaping public opinion, creating this environment where these pro-Russia, pro-authoritarian ideas could flourish. That's the big question, isn't it? Hartman really focuses on Fox News. He argues that they were constantly pushing these pro-Trump and often pro-Russia narratives. They'd repeat Trump's talking points, downplaying, sometimes even dismissing how serious Russian interference in U.S. elections was.
It's like they built this echo chamber where these ideas could just bounce around and gain traction, even if they weren't based in reality.
That's a great way to put it. And Hartman argues that this constant reinforcement, it really affected how the public perceived things, made people more likely to believe those stories, even if they were misleading or just plain false.
And this isn't just Hartman's opinion, right? There are other sources that back this up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's this article from Vox from 2018. Disgraced Trump advisor Mike Flynn admits he worked as a foreign agent for the Turkish government. It's a really good example. Remember Mike Flynn, Trump's national security advisor? Very briefly.
Yeah, we talked about him earlier. The guy who lied to the FBI about his talks with the Russian ambassador.
That's him. But this Vox piece, it looks at a different side of Flynn's shady dealings. His work as a foreign agent for the Turkish government while he was advising Trump during the campaign.
Okay, so how does this connect to the media?
Well, the article says that Flynn wrote an op-ed for The Hill, that conservative news outlet, basically pushing Turkish propaganda and criticizing the Obama administration for not supporting Turkey's leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, enough, who, by the way, was becoming more and more authoritarian.
So he was using conservative media to spread pro-Turkey talking points while secretly working for the Turkish government. That's a huge conflict of interest.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the role of conservative media in amplifying these potentially dangerous ideas, often without being upfront about conflicts of interest or really examining where those ideas are coming from.
That's troubling. So we've got Fox News parroting Trump's pro-Russia rhetoric, and then you have people like Flynn using conservative outlets to spread pro-Turkey propaganda. It paints a pretty disturbing picture of how information can be twisted, how certain narratives can take hold.
It does, and it highlights just how important media literacy and critical thinking are, especially now with social media and all these hyper-partisan news sources. We have to be aware of the potential for bias and manipulation. We have to be willing to question our own assumptions and look for different perspectives.
Right. It's not about blindly trusting one source. It's about being informed, being a critical consumer of information.
Exactly. And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive. We're not telling you what to think. We're just trying to give you the information and the insights you need to form your own conclusions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. Schedule F, Putin's payout, Trump's actions with those intelligence agencies, the role of conservative media. It's a lot to take in, and it raises some really big questions about the future of American democracy, the balance of power in the world.
It does. And I think the main takeaway here is that we all need to be vigilant, engaged, informed citizens. We need to hold our leaders accountable, demand transparency, and be wary of anyone who tries to undermine our democratic institutions and values.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been, well, illuminating and unsettling, but it really underscores the importance of critical thinking and civic engagement. It's a reminder that the future of our democracy depends on us staying informed, asking tough questions, and demanding better from our leaders.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. If we accept that foreign powers might try to influence our elections, our government, what can we do as individuals, as a society, to protect our democracy, to make sure that our leaders are truly acting in the best interests of the nation?
That's a powerful question, and one that we all need to think about carefully. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking exploration. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions.